So you were ambassador in Venezuela twice.
I was.
The first time you were sort of removed by Mr. Chavez. Talk to us a little bit about those years and what you think precipitated the your removal as ambassador, and then how it evolved that you came back a second time as ambassador to Venezuela.
There are indeed two ways to look at my engagement in Venezuela. I was ambassador for the United States from 2007 until 2010. For the first portion of that time, I was President Bush's ambassador. I was welcomed with full diplomatic honors at the beginning of that tenure, but relations became more tense over the course of my first 13, 14 months in the country. President Morales of Bolivia had expelled the American ambassador, accusing him of complicity in some social difficulties in a remote province there, baselessly, I would add. And virtually immediately we thought, whoops, we'll see how this plays with President Chavez, because we assumed that in point of fact, there would be some reaction to that expulsion. And then on September 11th in 2008, President Chavez went on national television and expressed his solidarity with the decision by President Morales to expel my colleague, and said in solidarity with that, I would be given 72 hours to leave the country. They were apparently not entirely aware, or at least his office wasn't, that I was in fact out of the country. Then, some months later, when President Obama attended the Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago, there was a brief encounter between the two presidents, on the margins of which Secretary and Foreign Minister, or the two presidents, the issue of restoring relations at the ambassadorial level was raised. And though it had not happened before, that an American ambassador expelled formally and declared persona non grata had returned to the country from which he had been expelled, I got the call from the Assistant Secretary of State on behalf of the President and Secretary, asking if I would go back, which is what I did. So I in turn I went back to Venezuela in time for the 4th of July celebration in 2009, and finished my tour as ambassador there.
Let's talk about Mr. Chavez a little bit. Why was he so popular, and has that popularity really extended over to President Maduro?
Well, it was interesting to observe President Chavez, if you will, in situ. I heard, many disparaging remarks from his critics, and observed an almost reverential affection for him among the poorest of the poor. Chavez was able to talk to the common people, and they appreciated that. Secondly, he announced a whole series of social missions designed to alleviate at least some of the suffering of the poorest of the poor. And he played too to the more nationalist sentiments of those who were looking to see Venezuela assert itself, and in particular assert its independence from what he came to call the empire, the rapacious North, meaning the United States. So there was the sense that Chavez came from the people, that he spoke their language, and that he was concerned about their welfare. Those who opposed him believed that he very seriously damaged the country's democratic institutions, and that the space for real sort of opposition political activity pretty consistently shrunk over the course of his administration.
And has the well-being of the average Venezuelan improved since Chavez took over in '98?
Well, it appears, according to most international statistics, that poverty was reduced to some degree. When Chavez came into office, it was estimated that as much as 60% of the Venezuelan population fell into classes, they would call them D and E, or the lower part of C, D, and E, and they use a five layered scale. There was an enormous amount of poverty in Venezuela, and he made addressing the issue of poverty a central part of his political dialogue with the nation. He absolutely spent money on social programs, but also on foreign policy issues. And to some degree, President Maduro now is dealing with the consequences of the fact that often Chavez preferred to invest in social programs rather than infrastructure or making capital investments in the oil industry, et cetera. And as a consequence, they have blackouts and shortages and what have you. Some poverty was reduced, but much of the productive sector in Venezuela, virtually most of the non-oil industries, have all struggled with the Chavista or the Bolivarian attempt to transform the nation into a socialist state, which he always maintained was his goal.
Do you think the recent sort of thaw between Venezuela and Colombia, the two presidents met at the border, committed to work together on issues like, human trafficking and drug trafficking. Do you think that's going to make a difference? Is that going to kind of support some of the U.S.'s policy objectives in the region?
Well, I think that almost everyone in the region hopes that it makes a decided difference. Colombia and Venezuela have a very important trade relationship. I think both sides want to see that prosper. They actually have an energy relationship, and if I'm not mistaken, notwithstanding Venezuela's immense energy reserves, they actually import a certain amount of natural gas from Colombia. I think the United States wants to see this dialogue prosper and hopes that it results in not only better relations between the two countries, but in enhanced cooperation across the board within the hemisphere.
Now, we can't close off this conversation without talking about Mr. Snowden.
Yes.
Will he or won't he be accepted into Venezuela? And what would be the consequence to our relationships with Venezuela if they do provide him asylum?
First, there is the question of logistics. Mr. Snowden has to get to Venezuela in order to be sheltered in Venezuela, in order to be granted asylum there. President Maduro has offered asylum. But in the meantime, Mr. Snowden has, as I think we all know, asked for at least temporary asylum in Russia. The United States has made very clear to many governments that we want Mr. Snowden to be returned to the United States to face charges here. I think the bottom line is it would make renewing the conversations that have recently been suspended between the United States and Venezuela aimed at improving the bilateral relationship more difficult.
The InterAmerican Press Association has decided to hold its annual meeting in Denver. I wonder if you could help us in Colorado understand the significance of the organization and its role with respect to the freedom of the press and other important issues.
Clearly, the free press, the frequently courageous free press, played a central role in precipitating the return to democracy or an embrace of democracy, and as countries embrace democracy, in the consolidation of democratic practice throughout the hemisphere. And of course, we know that it's immensely important to our own political life. Mm-hmm. So it's a great organization. I think it would be a real pleasure for Denver to host them.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Duddy, for being with us here on WorldDenver Talks.
Well, I very much enjoyed my visit. Thank you for having me. Denver's been terrific. It's my first time here, and I've really enjoyed both the city and the opportunity to explore some of the area just out in and around the city.